going to teach you how to manage your fatigue, because in spite of weeding out exercises with a poor stimulus to fatigue ratio, as you do progressive overload, as I've mentioned before, there's going to be little bits of fatigue that you accumulate here and there, and fatigue being cumulative, it's going to add up. So there is going to be some fatigue that is inescapable, but that does not make it insurmountable. So today I'm going to be teaching you how to manage the fatigue that you do have. So now let's get into the topic of fatigue and its management with a much more thorough introduction to the concept of fatigue. Fatigue is the product of either nearing, reaching, or exceeding your maximum recoverable volume. And if you don't ever experience it, that means you haven't ever been pushing yourself as far as you can go and should be. Alright, unless you are young, some people who are under the age of 25 may simply never experience it due to their youth. But it still could really be an indicator that you just aren't going as hard as you can and should. Alright, so saying that you never experience fatigue is really nothing to brag about. If that is the case, I recommend you do much more progressive overload and push yourself much harder and further, okay? But for those of us who do train adequately hard enough, you're going to experience different types of fatigue at different times. See, there's actually multiple different kinds of fatigue. First is muscle group fatigue, and this is actually the best kind, which is why I'm listing it first. You obviously want to feel some sense of having done work with your target muscles that you were working. So if you are experiencing fatigue in your target muscle group, that's a good sign that you've got a good workout. Next is organ fatigue. This could be lung and respiratory system fatigue. It could be heart and cardiovascular system fatigue. It can be brain and psychological fatigue. It could be stomach and digestive system fatigue. You can experience fatigue from any of your organs, and this could come up in any variety of ways. Not just doing endurance training and getting cardiovascular or respiratory system fatigue, but you can actually get psychological fatigue and even burnout from having stress in your life, and thus not psychologically being able to handle the stress of the gym, because you're putting stress not only on your body when you work out, but on your brain as well. Your brain is secreting adrenaline and all these endorphins, and having this cortisol stress response. And so if you've got a number of stressors in your life, again, that's going to be cumulative. It's all going to add up, and you could start to have some mental fatigue and even burnout. Another thing that happens when you are going through a bulking cycle is you might experience stomach and digestive system fatigue. Having to eat a gram of protein per pound or maybe a little bit more per day, and getting 3,000, 3,500, maybe 4,000 calories a day. I've heard of some bodybuilders who are eating 10,000 calories a day. All of those calories and carbs and fat and protein having to be processed by your digestive system every single day, and being given to it in a steady stream where it never gets any rest, can be very fatiguing. And people who've done this before know what I'm talking about. You get stomach aches, you get indigestion, you get these farts, So it can be very fatiguing to your stomach and digestive tract to be doing bulking. So some of these types of organ fatigue aren't exactly bad, like if you're doing endurance training and you're getting respiratory or cardio fatigue, but others can be bad. Getting psychological fatigue and burnout can be really devastating to you. It can affect you in all aspects of life. Getting stomach and digestive system fatigue can cause actual health problems. I know because I've been there. I've had 2 ulcers, an internal hernia, acid reflux, esophageal erosion, IBS, and that also causes immune system problems. So this is why when you are bulking, it is highly recommended to be doing clean bulking, as that will certainly help to minimize the amount of health problems that you could experience down there, and only be eating exactly as much as you need and no more. Now the next type of fatigue is joint and connective tissue fatigue. You're going to start to see some inflammation and fatigue occurring not just in your target muscle, but in the outer reaches, where your chest meets your shoulder joint, where your bicep meets the elbow joint. These areas will start to cause you aches and pains, and that's joint connective tissue fatigue that leads to inflammation. And this is a sign that if you keep on pushing harder and harder and harder for very much longer, that is going to turn into an injury. One of the first things that can and will happen is getting tendonitis, the tendon right there, and inflammation of the tendon right there. And then you could also get carpal tunnel, where all of your nerves throughout your forearm become inflamed, and then you won't be able to grip the bar very well anymore. You're going to get this burning sensation. Your hand is going to get stiff, and it's going to feel like it's falling asleep in a very, very painful way. You also can start to get this pain in your shoulder, like right about there. If you go to the doctor for that, the first thing they're going to think is shoulder impingement, which if you're using the form that I taught you in phase 3 properly, you should not get, and thus don't really need to be worried about. And you'll know if you have gotten shoulder impingement if you cannot lift your arm like this directly overhead. All right, if that's too painful, that's shoulder impingement. So that's why it's very important to take good care of your shoulders. But if it's just shoulder pain, you're just going to have to dial your training back a little, or if it persists, go to a physical therapist. All right, now this joint connective tissue fatigue and any inflammation that it causes usually won't lead to injury. Like I said, it's only if you continue to push yourself harder and harder and harder for kind of a long time. So when this starts to occur, this just means that you need to wrap up your block of progressive overload in the very near future. All right, so 2, maybe 3 weeks more tops. This is probably happening because you have already passed from your MEV to your MAV, and you're going up into your MAV now, so it should really only take you a few weeks to max out, and then you need to deload and get all that inflammation to go away and recover from that fatigue. Okay, what else can happen then beyond this, if you continue pushing yourself, is you can get central nervous system fatigue. And CNS fatigue really sucks. And this is something that will happen when you're training really hard. If you are doing, like a lot of high volume, high frequency, if you're doing full body workouts, a lot of circuits, interval training, stuff like that, that can be very fatiguing. You'll get CNS fatigue, which basically is super exhausting, and this can then also affect your stability and balance, different functions of the nervous system. It'll make your coordination off, certain skills will be off, and it can even affect your spine's ability to support itself. So that's something to watch out for. If that starts to happen, that means you need to end your block of progressive overload like ASAP. Okay, the next type, and these are building up here, the next type is systemic fatigue, and this basically means CNS fatigue combined with multiple other types of fatigue. It's just like a full body phenomenon at that point. You've been taxing your full system for a long time, and now you're going to be going through a sort of full body exhaustion. So that's systemic fatigue. If that happens, again, you need to be wrapping up your block of progressive overload like that week. And the last one is cumulative fatigue, which is basically either systemic fatigue or any number of the previous types of fatigue that are getting added up over time to the point where they have become exponentially greater than any one of their parts. And at that point, there has been so much accumulation that it's actually going to take you a little while to recover. So at that point, one single deload week is not going to be enough. All right, that cumulative fatigue, has put you into energy debt. All right, you've been in a deficit for a while, and then you started going into debt more and more and more. And so at that point, you're going to need more than just a deload week. You're going to need at least 2, maybe an active rest period or an off season, and you're probably going to need some physical therapy as well. All right, cumulative fatigue, it's usually a combination of systemic and or CNS fatigue paired with certain joints and connective tissues, certain organs, and then like almost every muscle group. It is something that can be not only exhausting and taxing, but pretty devastating as well. So when you start to go through cumulative fatigue or systemic fatigue, you're going to see a very serious performance drop-off. And that's when you're past your MRV for sure. Getting CNS fatigue means you probably hit your MRV, but when you get into that systemic and cumulative fatigue, where you've just become totally exhausted or experience a performance and strength fall off, that means you're past your MRV. And that means you need to deload now, because if you keep pushing yourself, even through the week that you have planned, you are at risk of injuring yourself. Okay, so if you do push yourself for the rest of that week, that needs to be the last week in your block, and just be warned that you could get injured, all right, because you probably should have ended your block last week. And I've actually been there myself multiple times where I've ignored joint connective tissue fatigue, and let it turn into tendonitis and carpal tunnel and, more major shoulder pain, and then let it turn into CNS fatigue and systemic fatigue, and let it keep accumulating until I have some major injury like a back spasm, which is extremely painful and puts you out of commission for months. Okay, so you really do need to watch out for these things. Like I said, muscle group fatigue and certain organ fatigue aren't really necessarily red flags, but are just a sign of training hard. But once you are getting into the joint and connective tissue fatigue, that is when you need to start planning for the end of your block of progressive overload. And if you are getting into CNS fatigue and some signs of systemic fatigue, that means it's got to end that week before you let it accumulate more and more and more. Because what fatigue does, as we learned in the last class, is that it increases exponentially compared to hypertrophy over time. So even if you had, this block of progressive overload planned where you were planning to increase your stimulus to a certain point, and you haven't gotten there yet, but your fatigue is accumulating to the point where it's turned into CNS and systemic fatigue, and you're getting very exhausted, it's imperative that you let go of that goal for now, realize it's not going to happen in that block, and take a deload and start over again after that with a new meso. And it's also imperative when training hard to choose exercises with a nice low stimulus to fatigue ratio, and minimize or avoid altogether those with a high SFR.